Vaylith Carr had served the Dominion High Council for 300 cycles, and in all that time he had never seen anything that truly surprised him. He had watched empires rise and fall across the spiral arm, documented species that could bend reality with their thoughts, and recorded wars that burned entire star systems to ash. He believed with absolute certainty that the cosmos held no more secrets for an observer of his experience. Then the humans arrived, and everything he thought he knew crumbled like dust in a solar wind. They came from a small blue world in an unremarkable corner of an average galaxy, a species so young that their entire recorded history would barely fill a single chapter in Dominion archives. Their ships were crude things, of metal and fire, their weapons primitive compared to the energy lances of the Vorax or the mind-shatter bombs of the Kron Collective. Their lifespans were laughably short, most of them living barely a century before their bodies failed them. The Dominion had dismissed them without a second thought when their first ambassador vessel appeared at the edge of Council space. Commander Jack Sullivan had requested an audience with the High Council, speaking through translation devices that crackled with interference. He stood before beings who had lived for millennia, creatures of light and thought and ancient power, and he did not tremble. He spoke of alliance and mutual protection, of shared defense against the threats that lurked in the dark spaces between stars. The Council had laughed at him. Vaylith remembered watching from his observation platform as the human commander received their rejection. He had expected anger or despair, or perhaps pleading. The usual responses from lesser species denied the protection of Dominion membership. Instead, he saw something in those human eyes that he could not name. Something calm and patient and utterly unreadable. Sullivan had simply nodded his head in acknowledgement, thanked the Council for their time in that strange flat voice humans used, and departed without protest or wounded pride. His small ship had vanished into the void, and the Council had forgotten about the humans within days. Vaylith had not forgotten. Something about that human commander stayed in his memory like a splinter under skin, an irritation he could not quite explain or dismiss. 3 cycles later, the Harrow swarm descended upon the outer colonies. The swarm was ancient, older even than the Dominion itself. They were a species of chitinous nightmares that consumed everything in their path, stripping worlds of all biological matter and leaving nothing but bare rock behind. They had slumbered in the dark spaces for 10,000 years, and now they had awakened hungry. The Dominion's mighty fleet, 700 vessels of unmatched power, moved to intercept them at the border. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, only 39 Dominion ships remained, fleeing in scattered retreat, while the swarm's countless bioships blotted out the stars behind them. Colony after colony fell in the following days. Vaylith watched the reports come in with growing horror, as worlds he had visited, species he had documented, civilizations he had admired, were consumed by the endless tide of the swarm. The Dominion High Council convened emergency sessions, debating strategies and alliances, but everyone knew the truth, that no one wanted to speak aloud. They were losing, and they were losing badly. Then, a transmission arrived from the Outer Rim, broadcast on all frequencies in every known language. Vaylith was present in the council chamber when it played, and he would remember every word until the day his consciousness finally faded. "This is Commander Jack Sullivan of the Human Alliance vessel Defiant," the voice said through the speakers, calm and steady as it had been on the day of rejection. "We have monitored the swarm's advance, and we understand the threat you face. The Human Alliance is prepared to render assistance. Our fleet will arrive at Kethera Prime in 72 hours. We are coming to help." The council chamber erupted in chaos. Some members demanded the humans be turned away, arguing that their primitive ships would only add to the casualties. Others suggested accepting any help available, no matter how small. High Counselor Mathan silenced them all with a wave of his ancient hand. "Let them come," he said in a voice heavy with exhaustion, and something that might have been despair. We cannot afford to reject any ally now, even one as insignificant as the humans. Valith was assigned to document the human involvement in the conflict, a task he accepted with quiet curiosity. He traveled to Kethera Prime aboard a diplomatic shuttle, arriving 2 days before the human fleet was expected. The colony world was in chaos, its population of 3 million souls desperately trying to evacuate. While the Dominion garrison prepared for a siege they did not expect to survive. The garrison commander was a Silathi named Tralix, a being of crystalline structure and mathematical precision. He showed Valith the defense plans with something approaching resignation in his faceted eyes. "We have 40,000 soldiers," Tralix explained, his voice chiming like broken glass. "The swarm will arrive with biomass sufficient to overwhelm us within days. I have calculated our survival probability at less than 4%. We will hold as long as we can to allow evacuation, but the mathematics are clear." Valith nodded slowly, recording every detail for his eventual report. He had seen this scenario play out on other worlds, brave defenders holding hopeless positions while civilians fled, buying time with their lives. It was the way of things when facing a force like the swarm. On the 3rd day the human fleet arrived. Valith stood at the observation window of the garrison headquarters and watched them emerge from faster-than-light travel. 12 ships of varying size, forming up in a defensive pattern around the planet. 12 ships against a swarm that had destroyed 700 Dominion vessels. Lieutenant Commander Katie Morris led the ground forces. 3,000 soldiers in armor that looked almost crude compared to the elegant designs of Dominion troops. She was 29 years old, barely past childhood by the standards of most galactic species, yet she commanded with an authority that made even Tralix pause. Valith observed her first briefing with the Joint Defense Forces, recording every word and gesture for his archives. She stood before a holographic display of the planet, her short brown hair pulled back from a face that showed no fear, despite the impossible odds they faced. "We are going to hold this world," she said, her voice carrying across the briefing room with quiet certainty. "Sergeant Ben Carter will lead the Eastern Defensive Line. Corporal Ryan Hughes will establish fallback positions in the mountain passes. Specialist Amy Nguyen will coordinate medical evacuations." She looked around the room at the gathered soldiers, human and alien alike, and Valith saw something kindle in her eyes that he had never witnessed in any species he had studied. "The civilians of this world are counting on us to give them time to escape," Katie Morris continued. "Every hour we hold is another transport ship reaching safety. Every position we defend is another family that gets to live. We will give them that time, whatever it costs." Tralix spoke up from the back of the room, his crystalline voice cutting through the silence that followed her words. "The mathematics of this defense guarantee 70% casualties among ground forces. This strategy is illogical." Katie Morris looked at him for a long moment, and Valith felt something shift in the air of the briefing room, something he could not quite identify. "We know," she said simply. And then she smiled. Valith did not understand what he had witnessed in that briefing room, and the confusion stayed with him through the long hours that followed. He had documented hundreds of species preparing for battle across his 3 centuries of service, and he knew the patterns well. Soldiers facing certain death responded with fear or resignation, or sometimes a kind of numb acceptance. The humans responded with none of these things. He watched them in the hours before the swarm arrived, moving through the garrison with purpose and energy that seemed almost absurd given what they faced. They checked their weapons and shared meals together. They laughed at jokes he could not understand. They embraced one another with fierce affection. Sergeant Ben Carter, a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples and scars on his hands, gathered his squad in the eastern barracks, and spoke to them in low tones. Vaylith positioned himself nearby, recording everything. "Listen up," Carter said, his voice rough but warm. "We all know what is coming. We all know the odds. But I have served with every one of you, and I know what you are capable of. When the swarm hits that eastern line, they are going to find out what human soldiers can do." A young soldier near the back raised her hand. Her name was Lisa Chen, barely 22 years old, and Vaylith could see the fear in her eyes even as she fought to hide it. "Sergeant, do you really think we can hold them?" she asked. Carter looked at her for a long moment, and then he walked over and put his hand on her shoulder. "I think we are going to give those bugs the worst day of their lives," he said. "And if we fall fighting for something that matters. There is no better way for a soldier to go." The young woman nodded, and something changed in her expression, the fear giving way to something harder and more determined. Vaylith had seen commanders give speeches before battle many times, but this was different. Carter was not promising victory or glory or even survival. He was offering something else entirely, a sense of purpose and belonging that seemed to flow through the humans like electricity through a circuit. He made his way to the command center, where Lieutenant Commander Morris was coordinating with the orbital fleet. Commander Sullivan's voice crackled through the speakers, discussing defensive patterns and targeting priorities with his subordinates. "The swarm vanguard will hit atmosphere in 6 hours, Sullivan was saying. "Captain Nick Palmer, I need your ship covering the northern evacuation corridor. The Defiant will hold the center. All other vessels, form up on my position." "Commander," one of his officers responded, "if we hold the center against the main swarm force, we will be taking the worst of their fire. The Defiant may not survive the engagement." There was a pause, and then Sullivan's voice came back, calm and utterly certain. "I know, that is why we will be there. Our job is to buy time for the evacuation transports. Everything else is secondary." Vaylith felt that strange sensation again, that shifting in his understanding that he could not quite grasp. These humans spoke of their own deaths as though they were discussing the weather, accepting the possibility with a casual ease that seemed almost inhuman. He approached Lieutenant Commander Morris after the communication ended, his recording devices active. "May I ask you a question?" he said. She turned to face him, her expression tired but alert. "That is why you are here. Your species accepts these odds without hesitation," Vaylith said carefully. "You know that most of your soldiers will not survive this battle, yet they prepare to fight anyway. I do not understand why." Morris was quiet for a moment, considering his question with a seriousness that surprised him. "Do you know what the hardest thing about command is?" she finally asked. Vaylith shook his head. "It is not making the tough decisions or sending people into danger," she said. "The hardest thing is knowing that your soldiers trust you to make their sacrifice mean something. Every person in this garrison chose to be here. They could have stayed home, could have let someone else do the fighting, but they came because they believe that protecting innocent lives is worth dying for." She gestured toward the window, where the first civilian transports were already lifting off toward safety. "Each one carries thousands of people who will get to live because my soldiers are willing to die. That is not a tragedy, observer. That is the whole point." Vaylith recorded her words, but found himself struggling to process them. In his experience, species fought to survive, to protect their own genetic legacy, to ensure the continuation of their civilization. The idea of dying for strangers, for people you would never meet, seemed to violate every principle of evolutionary logic. The swarm arrived at dusk. They came screaming down through the atmosphere in waves of biopods and dropships, thousands upon thousands of them, darkening the sky like a living storm. Vaylith watched from the command center as the first wave hit the outer defenses, and the battle for Cathara Prime began. The eastern line held first contact. Sergeant Carter's position was struck by 300 swarm warriors in the opening minutes. chitinous nightmares with razor limbs and acid blood pouring across the defensive barriers. Valith monitored the communication channels, listening to the chaos of combat. "Contact east! Heavy contact east!" someone was shouting. "They are everywhere." Carter's voice cut through the noise, steady and commanding. "Hold the line! Lisa, cover the left flank. Danny, get that heavy gun repositioned. Nobody falls back until I give the order." The fighting was brutal and close, hand-to-hand in some places where the swarm breached the barriers. Valith watched through drone feeds as human soldiers fought with rifles and blades and bare fists, refusing to give ground even as their numbers dwindled. On the right flank, Corporal Ryan Hughes organized a counterattack that pushed the swarm back from a critical choke point. He was wounded twice in the first hour, but he refused evacuation and kept fighting, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "We do not stop," he bellowed at his troops. "We do not quit. Every second we hold is another family on those transports." In orbit, Commander Sullivan's fleet engaged the main swarm force. The Defiant took the center position as promised, drawing fire from dozens of bioships, while the other human vessels provided covering support. Captain Nick Palmer's ship, the Wanderer, was hit in the first exchange, its engines crippled by acid projectiles. Rather than retreat, Palmer ordered his crew to maintain firing positions, using their remaining weapons to cover the evacuation corridor even as their ship died around them. "Wanderer to Fleet Command," Palmer's voice came through the speakers, strained but calm. "We are going down, but we are taking a few of them with us." "It has been an honor, Commander." "The honor is mine, Nick," Sullivan replied. "Give them hell." The Wanderer exploded 3 minutes later, but not before destroying 4 swarm vessels and clearing a path for 6 evacuation transports to escape. Valith watched it all with growing amazement, his understanding of warfare shifting and cracking with every moment. These humans did not fight like any species he had ever observed. They did not calculate acceptable losses or preserve their forces for future engagements. They simply refused to stop. As the first night of the siege wore on, the human casualties mounted. But so did the swarm's losses, far beyond anything the mathematical models had predicted. The humans were not winning, not exactly, but they were not losing either. They were holding, and every hour they held was another ship full of civilians reaching safety among the stars. The battle for Cathara Prime lasted 9 hours, and Valith recorded every moment of it. He had witnessed countless conflicts in his centuries of service, battles that burned across star systems, and wars that lasted generations. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what the humans showed him that night. They fought like something out of ancient legend, creatures of fire and fury who simply refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. The Eastern Line fell and reformed 3 times before dawn. Sergeant Carter held a bridge crossing for 4 hours against waves of swarm warriors. His squad of 40 soldiers reduced to 12, then 8, then 5. When their ammunition ran low, they fought with combat knives and entrenching tools. When their blades broke, they fought with their fists and teeth. Valith monitored Carter's communications throughout the night, listening as the gruff sergeant encouraged his dwindling forces. "We hold this bridge, or nobody holds it. Lisa, watch your 6. Danny, get that barrier back up." Private Lisa Chen, the young soldier who had asked if they could really win, fought beside her sergeant until a swarm warrior's claw tore through her armor. Valith watched through drone feed as Carter dragged her behind cover, still firing his weapon with one hand while the other pressed against her wound. "You are going to be fine," Carter told her, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that sounded like desperation. "Medical evacuation is coming. Just hold on." "Sergeant," she gasped, blood on her lips. "Did we do it? Did we hold?" Carter looked at the bridge behind them, littered with the bodies of swarm warriors, the defensive position battered but unbroken. "Yeah, kid," he said softly. "We held." you held. I am so proud of you." She died 3 minutes later, and Valith watched Carter close her eyes with gentle hands before picking up his weapon and returning to the line. There were no tears, no dramatic outbursts of grief. There was only the battle and the duty and the stubborn human refusal to stop fighting. On the western flank, Specialist Aiming Gin performed acts that Valith could only describe as miraculous. She was a combat medic, trained to save lives rather than take them. But when the swarm broke through the medical station's defenses, she picked up a fallen soldier's rifle and fought alongside the security team. When the position was overrun, she carried 2 wounded Dominion soldiers across a kilometer of open ground while swarm drones hunted her from above. Valith tracked her progress through satellite imagery, watching this small human woman stumble through rubble and fire with 2 beings twice her size slung across her shoulders. She was hit twice during the crossing, once in the leg and once in the shoulder, but she did not stop. She did not even slow down. She just kept moving, one agonizing step at a time, until she reached the secondary medical station and deposited her patients with the surgeons. "Get them stabilized," she ordered, her voice thin with pain. "They need blood. O-negative should work for most Dominion species." "Specialist, you need treatment yourself," one of the medics protested. Nguyen shook her head, already moving toward the door. "Later. There are more wounded out there." She returned to the field 3 more times that night, each time bringing back soldiers who would have died without her intervention. Valith calculated that she personally saved 14 lives during the battle, 7 human and 7 Dominion, treating them all with the same desperate determination. In the mountain passes, Corporal Ryan Hughes organized a fighting retreat that bought the civilian evacuation an extra 2 hours. His forces were outnumbered 10-1, but he used the terrain with brutal efficiency, collapsing tunnels on swarm columns and triggering landslides that buried entire waves of attackers. When his position was finally overwhelmed, Hughes ordered his remaining soldiers to fall back while he covered their retreat alone. Valith listened to the final transmission from his position. "This is Hughes to command. The passes are lost, but the evacuation corridor is clear. My people are heading to the secondary line. I will hold here as long as I can." "Ryan, get out of there," Lieutenant Commander Morris responded, urgency cracking through her professional tone. "That is an order." "Sorry, Commander," Hughes replied, and Valith could hear gunfire in the background, the screech of swarm warriors, the sound of a man fighting for his life. "Someone has to hold the door. Tell my sister I love her." The transmission cut out moments later. The space battle above Kethera Prime reached its climax, as the swarm's command ship moved into position over the planet. It was a massive thing, larger than a small moon, pulsing with organic energy that made Valith's sensors flicker and distort. Commander Sullivan's fleet had been reduced to 4 ships, battered and burning but still fighting. The Defiant had taken more damage than any vessel should be able to survive. Its hull breached in a dozen places, half its weapons offline, but Sullivan refused to retreat. "All remaining vessels target the command ship's central mass. Everything we have, right down its throat." "Commander, our weapons cannot penetrate its armor at this range," one of his officers reported. "We need to get closer, but if we close to effective range, the point defense systems will tear us apart." Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, and Valith found himself holding his breath, waiting to hear what the human would say. "Then I will make them look somewhere else," Sullivan finally replied. "All ships, hold position and maintain covering fire. The Defiant is going in." "Jack, no," someone shouted, but Sullivan had already cut the channel. Valith watched through orbital sensors as the Defiant accelerated toward the command ship, weaving through defensive fire with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. The swarm's bioweapons tore into the human vessel, ripping away armor plating and destroying weapon systems, but the ship kept coming. At the last moment, Sullivan pointed his dying ship directly at the command ship's core, and activated the faster-than-light drive at point-blank range. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface, a flash of light that turned night into day for a brief, eternal instant. The swarm command ship broke apart, its controlling intelligence destroyed, and across the battlefield the swarm warriors faltered and fell into disarray. Valeth understood then what had happened. Sullivan had sacrificed himself to decapitate the enemy, trading one ship and one life for the survival of millions. On the ground, the human soldiers saw the explosion and knew what it meant. Lieutenant Commander Morris's voice came through every communication channel. Steady despite the tears Valeth could see running down her face. "Commander Sullivan has destroyed the enemy command ship," she announced. "The swarm is in disarray. All units, press the attack. Drive them off our world." The humans surged forward with renewed fury, and the swarm, leaderless and confused, began to break. By dawn, the last of the enemy had been driven into the wastelands or destroyed, and Cathara Prime belonged to the living once more. Valeth stood in the command center as the sun rose over a battlefield littered with the dead, and he finally understood what he had been witnessing. These humans did not fight because they expected to win. They fought because they believed some things were worth dying for, and they proved that belief with their blood and their lives. He had seen many species at war, but he had never seen anything like this. The silence after battle was something Valeth had experienced many times, but the silence on Cathara Prime felt different. It wasn't the empty quiet of defeat or the exhausted stillness of a Pyrrhic victory. It was something else, something that hung in the air, like the smoke that still rose from the ruined defensive positions. The humans had won, against all probability, and every mathematical model the Dominion possessed. 12 ships and 3,000 soldiers had broken a swarm that had destroyed 700 Dominion vessels, and they had done it by refusing to accept the possibility of failure. But victory had come at a terrible cost. Valeth walked through the aftermath with his recording devices active, documenting everything he saw. The battlefield was a nightmare landscape of broken bodies and shattered equipment, human and swarm tangled together in the frozen embrace of death. The eastern line where Sergeant Carter had held was barely recognizable, the ground churned to mud by combat and stained dark with blood from a dozen species. He found Carter sitting alone near the bridge, staring at nothing with eyes that had aged a century in a single night. The sergeant's uniform was torn and caked with dried blood, some of it his own and some belonging to others. His hands rested on his knees, still and quiet for the first time since the battle began. "Sergeant Carter," Valeth said carefully, "may I speak with you?" Carter looked up slowly, as if returning from a great distance. "Observer," he acknowledged. "Still recording everything, huh?" "It is my function," Valeth replied. "I am trying to understand what I witnessed here." The sergeant laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I have been a soldier for 20 years, and I still don't fully understand it myself." Valeth settled beside him, his sensors recording the scene for analysis that might never come. "You held this position for hours against overwhelming numbers. You lost many of your soldiers, yet you continued fighting, even when the mathematics clearly indicated defeat was inevitable. Why?" Carter was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting back to the bridge. "You see that crossing? Lisa Chen died right there, about 10 meters from where we are sitting. She was 22 years old, fresh out of training, scared out of her mind. But when the swarm came, she stood her ground and fought like a demon." He paused, and Valeth saw something shift in his expression. Grief and pride tangled together in a way the observer had never witnessed. "She asked me before the battle if I thought we could win," Carter continued. "I told her the truth. I did not know if we would win. But I knew that if we did not try, all those civilians on the evacuation ships would die." Lisa understood that. She chose to stay and fight anyway, knowing what it might cost her. And that choice, Valeth said slowly, trying to grasp the concept. That willingness to die for others, that is what drives humans in battle? Carter shook his head. It is not about dying, observer. It is about living. We fight so that others can live. We sacrifice so that the people we care about have a chance. Lisa did not die because she wanted to die. She died because she wanted those families on those ships to survive. There is a difference. Valeth processed this information, adding it to the growing collection of data that was slowly reshaping his understanding of humanity. I believe I am beginning to understand, he said. Maybe, Carter replied. Or maybe you will never really get it. I have met a lot of aliens in my time, and most of them think we are crazy for the way we fight. They calculate odds and preserve forces and retreat when the numbers turn against them. And there is nothing wrong with that. It is sensible. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking with exhaustion. But humans are not always sensible. We are stubborn and emotional, and we form attachments that do not make logical sense. We will die for people we have never met because we decided they mattered. We will hold hopeless positions because someone has to. We will charge into certain death with a smile on our faces if it means protecting our people. He looked at Valeth with eyes that held no hatred, no triumph, only a bone-deep weariness and something that might have been compassion. That is what the cosmos does not understand about us. We are not strong, or smart, or advanced. We are just too stubborn to know when we are supposed to quit. We do not leave our people behind, she explained, when Valeth asked about the practice. Not ever. They fought with us. They died for us. The least we can do is bring them home. Home? Valeth repeated. Their homeworld is thousands of light years from here. The logistics of transporting so many bodies would be enormous. Morris looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. I do not care if it takes 100 ships and 1,000 years. Every soldier who fell on this world will be returned to their families. They deserve to be buried in the soil of Earth, with their names spoken and their sacrifice remembered. She paused, and when she spoke again her voice was softer. My grandmother used to tell me that the true measure of a people is how they treat their dead. We honor those who fell, because their sacrifice gave meaning to our survival. If we forget them, if we leave them behind, then what was the point of any of it? Valeth found himself without response. In Dominion culture, the dead were recycled. Their biological matter returned to the collective pool to be reformed into new life. The idea of preserving individual remains, of carrying them across the vastness of space, would be considered wasteful and illogical. But watching the humans move among their fallen, he began to see a different kind of logic at work. Not the cold mathematics of resource allocation, but something warmer and more enduring. He encountered a young soldier named Daniel Park sitting alone near the medical station, staring at the horizon with empty eyes. Park had fought in the mountain passes under Corporal Hughes, one of only 3 survivors from that position. Valeth approached him carefully, uncertain of human grieving customs. You lost friends in the battle, the observer said, unsure how else to begin. Park nodded without looking at him. Ryan Hughes saved my life, told me to run while he held them off. I tried to go back for him, but the others held me down. They said there was nothing I could do. Corporal Hughes chose to sacrifice himself so that others might survive, Valeth observed. His decision allowed you to reach safety. I know, Park said quietly. I know he did it because he cared about us. I know it was the right call tactically, but it doesn't make it easier. He was my friend. He taught me how to be a soldier, and now he is gone because I was not strong enough to help him. Valeth struggled to find appropriate words. His choice was his own. You are not responsible for his death. Park finally turned to look at him, and there were tears on his cheeks that he made no effort to hide. I know that too, but grief does not listen to logic. It just hurts, and you have to let it hurt, and eventually you learn to carry it. And then? Valeth asked. The young soldier stood up slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. And then you keep going, because that is what Ryan would want. That is what all of them would want. They did not die so we could sit here feeling sorry for ourselves. They died so we could live and keep fighting. He looked at Valeth with eyes that were red from crying, but fierce with determination. The swarm is still out there. There are other worlds that need protecting, and I am going to make sure Ryan's sacrifice meant something. He walked away toward the gathering of human soldiers, toward the work of recovery and rebuilding, and Valeth watched him go with something like wonder growing in his ancient heart. Valeth Carr stood before the High Council 3 cycles after the Battle of Cathara Prime. His recording devices filled with data that would reshape the Dominion's understanding of humanity forever. The ancient chamber fell silent as he took his position, the beings who ruled 1,000 worlds turning their attention to an observer who had witnessed something unprecedented. High Counselor Mathan regarded him with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall across 10,000 years. You have completed your documentation of the human involvement in the Cathara Prime engagement, he said. The Council awaits your analysis. Valeth took a moment to gather his thoughts. He had spent the journey back reviewing his recordings, analyzing the data, trying to find words that could capture what he had experienced. Nothing seemed adequate, but he had to try. The humans are not the strongest species in the cosmos, he began, his voice steady, despite the weight of what he was about to say. The Vorax could annihilate their entire civilization with a single coordinated thought. They are not the most numerous. The Kron Collective outnumbers them by a factor of roughly 1,000,000 to 1. Their technology is primitive compared to Dominion standards, their lifespans laughably short, their physical forms fragile and easily damaged. The Council stirred, some members expressing confusion at this seeming condemnation of a species that had just won an impossible victory. And yet, Valeth continued, they broke the Harrow Swarm. 12 ships and 3,000 soldiers accomplished what our fleet of 700 vessels could not. I watched them hold defensive positions against overwhelming odds. I watched them sacrifice themselves for strangers. I watched them grieve for their fallen, and then stand up and prepare to fight again. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the chamber. The question you tasked me to answer was simple. What are the humans, and what threat or opportunity do they represent to the Dominion? I had spent 3 cycles analyzing my observations, and I believe I finally understand the answer. Valeth activated his holographic display, projecting images of the battle across the chamber's walls. The Council watched as human soldiers charged into impossible odds, as Commander Sullivan's ship rammed the swarm command vessel, as Amy Nguyen carried wounded across a kilometer of open ground. The humans possess something that I have not observed in any other species during my 3 centuries of service. They carry fire in their hearts, a flame that does not extinguish even when logic and reason demand surrender. They love their own with a ferocity that transcends self-preservation. They will die for strangers without hesitation. They will sacrifice everything for an idea, a principle, a promise made to someone they may never meet. Counselor Trelaf, an ancient being of pure energy, spoke up. These behaviors seem evolutionarily disadvantageous. A species that willingly sacrifices its members should not survive long enough to achieve space travel. Valeth nodded. I thought the same thing initially, but I have come to understand that I was applying the wrong framework. Humans do not operate on individual survival calculus. They operate on collective protection instinct. They evolved as pack hunters, social creatures who survived by working together and protecting their group at all costs. He pulled up recordings of Sergeant Carter speaking to his troops, of Lieutenant Commander Morris explaining why they fought, of Daniel Park vowing to honor his fallen friend. They have taken this instinct and expanded it beyond biological logic, Valeth continued. They do not just protect their family, or their tribe, or their species. They extend this protective drive to anyone they choose to call friend. Anyone they decide is worth fighting for becomes part of their pack, and they will defend that pack with everything they have. The council chamber was utterly silent now. Every being present focused on Valeth's words. I watched Commander Sullivan ram his ship into the enemy command vessel, knowing he would die, so that strangers could live. I watched their soldiers hold the line until their bodies gave out, and then hold it a moment longer through sheer willpower. I watched them grieve for their fallen, weeping openly without shame, and then stand up and prepare to fight again. He looked at each council member in turn, making sure they understood the significance of what he was saying. The cosmos fears humanity because you cannot break them. You can kill them, certainly. They die as easily as any other biological species. But you cannot crush their spirit. You cannot make them despair. You cannot convince them that any cause is hopeless, any battle unwinnable, any sacrifice too great. High Counselor Mathan leaned forward, his ancient form radiating intense focus. And if we were to oppose them, if we were to become their enemy? Valeth felt a chill run through his consciousness. Then I would advise the Dominion to prepare for a war unlike anything we have ever faced. The humans would not stop. They would not surrender. They would fight and die and keep fighting, generation after generation, until either they won or their species ceased to exist. He pulled up one final recording. Daniel Park, tears on his face, vowing to continue fighting in honor of his fallen friend. They are pack-bonded to the universe itself, Valeth concluded. Anyone they call friend, they will fight for. Anyone they call family, they will die for. And they have looked upon the cosmos and decided that everyone deserves protection. The council chamber remained silent for a long time after he finished speaking. Valeth stood quietly, letting them process the implications of what he had shared. Finally, Counselor Veleth, the most conservative member of the council, spoke. You paint a troubling picture, observer. If the humans are as formidable as you suggest, they could pose a significant threat to Dominion stability. With respect, Counselor, you have missed the point. The humans are not a threat to those they consider friends. They are only dangerous to those who threaten what they have chosen to protect. If the Dominion allies with humanity, we gain protectors who will stand beside us against any enemy, who will sacrifice themselves for our survival without hesitation. He thought of Katie Morris explaining why they fought, of Amy Gwen carrying Dominion soldiers to safety, of Jack Sullivan giving his life to save a world that was not his own. But if we become their enemy, Valeth continued, if we threaten what they have sworn to defend, then we will face a foe that will never stop, never surrender, never accept defeat. They will keep coming until they win, or until the last human draws their final breath. High Counselor Mathan rose from his throne, his ancient form seeming to fill the chamber. What do you recommend, observer? Valeth Carr, who had watched 1,000 species rise and fall across 3 centuries of service, who had believed he had seen everything the cosmos could offer, gave the only answer he could. Make them our allies, he said. Whatever the cost, whatever they ask, grant them full membership in the Dominion, and treat them as equals in every way that matters, because I have seen what happens when humans decide someone is worth fighting for. He paused, letting his final words echo through the ancient chamber. And I have seen what happens to those who stand against them. The council voted unanimously in favor of alliance. 6 cycles later, Valeth stood on the observation deck of a Dominion station and watched the human delegation arrive for the formal signing ceremony. Lieutenant Commander Katie Morris led the human contingent, her uniform bearing new insignia that marked her promotion to full commander. Behind her walked the survivors of Kethera Prime, soldiers who had held the line against impossible odds. Among them was Daniel Park, no longer the grieving young man Valeth had spoken with on the battlefield. His eyes still held sorrow, but they also held purpose, and when he saw Valeth, he offered a small nod of recognition. The ceremony was brief by Dominion standards, but it marked a turning point in galactic history. Humanity had arrived on the cosmic stage, and nothing would ever be the same. Valeth watched the humans celebrate with their new allies, their strange laughter echoing through the station corridors, and he felt something he had not experienced in centuries. Hope. Because he had learned something during the Battle of Kethera Prime, something that changed everything he thought he knew about the nature of strength and courage, and what it meant to be alive. The cosmos was vast and dangerous, and full of terrors beyond imagining. But it also contained humanity. Stubborn, emotional, impossibly brave creatures who would stand against any darkness if it meant protecting those they loved. And that, Valeth realized, was why the cosmos feared them. Not because they were strong, or numerous, or technologically advanced, but because they simply refused to give up. And as long as there were humans in the universe, hope would never die.